This old, grainy film is of US soldiers landing in Cuba in 1898, a decisive turning point in Cuba's War of Independence against Spain. Many of the troops landed in a sheltered natural harbor called Guantanamo Bay. 120 years later, the Americans are still there, and Cuba wants it back. Cuba is the largest island in the Caribbean, strategically covering the sea routes on the southern flank of the United States. And there were some in Washington who were keen to get rid of the Spanish and annex the island. There was growing concern in the United States over Spain's brutal tactics of suppression, with newspaper headlines calling for the government to intervene. The pretext for the intervention was the fate of this battleship, the USS Maine, which in January 1898 sailed into Havana Bay. The visit was aimed at protecting US interests there in case the fighting got out of hand. But on the night, February the 15th, the Maine mysteriously exploded, killing more than 260 of the sailors on board. It may have been an accident, but the US blamed the Spanish, leading President William McKinley to declare war on Spain.
It was very hard for Cuba at that moment to accept a poisonous gift that was offered. It was like a poisoned apple offered on the table. Cubans believed in the good faith of the United States. Many of them had studied in the U.S. and saw the country as a nation of progress, freedom, and democracy. But it was neither progress, nor freedom, nor democracy that they brought to Cuba.
What they did bring was a rapid end to the war, a conflict that the Cubans had been waging. The US troops included volunteers such as the Rough Riders, led by Theodore Roosevelt, who later went on to become President of the United States. Roosevelt led his regiment in the decisive Battle of San Juan Hill, a bloody head-on assault against Spanish fortified positions on hilltops protecting Cuba's second city, Santiago. But when Spain surrendered, Cuba didn't gain its independence. Instead, it found itself under US military occupation. This is the governor's palace, the center of power during colonial times. But after the Spaniards surrendered, this became the headquarters of the US occupying force. The US flag flew above the palace for the next 4 years. In 1902, Washington handed Cuba its independence, but with conditions, including leasing Guantanamo Bay. The Platt Amendment also gave the US the right to intervene in Cuban affairs to protect its interests.
For 60 years, from January 1899 to January 1959, Cuba had to live its political life strongly subordinated to U.S. interests, firstly of a political nature and later of an economic nature.
Primero de carácter político y luego fundamentalmente de carácter económico.
The Cuban Revolution finally broke all links to the United States. In 2015, Washington restored diplomatic relations with Havana, but under US President Donald Trump, relations have been tense. Managing that relationship is one of the challenges Cuba's next president will face. Michael Voss, CGTN, Havana.